Okay, good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. My name is Dr. Christopher Shaw. I'm the Research Programme Lead at Climate Outreach. Thanks again for joining us today. Very excited to share with you these very timely results from some research we've been carrying out over the past few months. Before we get started with the presentation, just a few kind of housekeeping things. There is on this, with the Zoom, which we are recording this webinar, just to confirm, hope that's okay. There's a transcript function at the bottom. It says live transcript. So if you want subtitles, if you click on that, there's an option to show subtitles. So use that if you want to have that function. At the end of the presentation, you will be taken to a screen where there's a link to a survey for feedback on the presentation. So if you have a moment to complete that survey, that would be very welcome. So the structure today, if you go to the next slide, please, Emma. The structure for the presentation, it'll take about 25 minutes for the presentation. There's a lot of details in this research, which we can't go into completely in the presentation today, but we've uploaded it all onto the Britain Talks Climate Toolkit, and there will be links available to that toolkit, and we'll talk through a bit of that toolkit at the end. So this presentation, to keep it down to 25 minutes, we're looking at just the general kind of results that emerged from the research, key themes, just explain how we did the work, and then touch on what the findings were from the research and the implications for communicating net zero policies and energy policies and climate change. There's also a Q&A function with the Zoom at the bottom of the screen. So again, please do use that during the talk, and then we'll have time at the end of the presentation to go through the questions and answers. There's also an upvoting function, and we'll use that to prioritise which questions we address in the Q&A. So without further ado, I shall pass over to our Director of Programmes and Research, Dr. Amira Sawas, and she'll just give a bit of background to the project and the work that we've been doing at Climate Outreach.
Thanks,
over
Chris.
to you, Amira.
Cheers. So, hi and welcome to our event, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'd like to just begin by telling you a little bit about Climate Outreach, although I'm really grateful to see many of you returning to our webinars, so many of you do know about us. So we're a team of social scientists and practitioners who engage with some of the most fundamental questions around climate change and its communication with publics. All of this work is designed to help build broad-based public support for climate action. This is something that we call a social mandate. So our projects have all been created specifically to build knowledge and understanding about how public engagement and communication can be best used to create this social mandate. And the Britain Talks Climate project is really central to that effort in the UK. So today we're going to explore some of the most pressing issues facing the UK's climate efforts, the topic of net zero and fairness. The UK has reached a point where the majority of the public are concerned about climate change, and that they're also united on the need to act, but it looks different for different people. So now the challenge is to agree on how to get there and bring the public along, both in terms of individual behaviour change, lifestyles, and support for policy interventions governing how, for example, energy is generated and used. So how these changes are perceived by wider publics in high emitting countries is really vital. It's important that policies are materially fair, but it's also important that policies are communicated in ways which are honest, which engage with people's deeply held values and identity, and build a kind of meaningful bottom-up support for decarbonisation. Failure to understand these issues could lead to resistance and rejection of the policies and potentially further polarize the debate about climate change and the actions required to curb it. And we have seen that in some other countries. So it's really important that we invest in understanding the general publics in different countries. So when we first envisioned this project in the UK, we originally planned to look only at one of the segments, what we call loyal nationals, identified in the Britain Talks Climate segmentation. since they were most sensitive to culture war dynamics. However, when we actually came to start it, we were still facing a global pandemic amidst rising energy and fuel prices, as well as other cost of living pressures, and also the risks of a looming conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So the context had shifted quite significantly, and based on some really wise advice from our funder, we broadened the approach to include 4 segments of the Britain Talks Climate segmentation, who all describe their politics as centrist or centre-right, to cover key battlegrounds and audiences to ensure public support for net zero. So in this webinar, we hope to offer insights that can sustain strong support for climate action across Britain and maintain momentum in the face of many overlapping crises. And of course, as Chris has said, we can't cover everything today, but we love to engage with you, so please do reach out for more information. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mira. That was great, very useful introduction. And I'm just going to do a little bit more, just one moment on a bit of context for this research. And if we can just go back to the slide. So at Climate Outreach, we've been talking with the public about various elements of climate policies and climate change for 15 years. And there's a lot of Britain Talks climate work out there. Really great work being done, not just by us, by others using the toolkit. And we've been working in this space around working with centre and centre-right audiences for a long time. And that was, in a way, partly what originally Climate Outreach was trying to do, move the debate out of just being a concern for environmentalists to making, as Mira says, a broader social mandate. So what I want to talk about, just before we get into the discussion of these results, is just take a moment to reflect on some of the themes that we've seen emerge from this research, which are aligned and confirm what we've seen elsewhere over the past 15 years, and which we think are still very strong recommendations and guidance for public engagement, especially at a time, and it doesn't look like they're having much success with it, but nonetheless, the Net Zero Watch and others are talking about, well, net zero will make you colder and it'll make you poorer. Now, in one sense, we could just reply and say, well, net zero is designed to make you richer because it'll save your energy bills because you'll use less energy through better energy efficiency, and also make you warmer, again, through improved energy efficiency, etc. But it's a bit more of a challenge for us, is that, because we're trying to move society on towards this net zero transition. We're not kind of dealing with the status quo. We want to change the status quo, move things. So our challenge is a bit of a more, we have to be a bit more nuanced, a bit more clever with what we're doing. But one of the themes that we've always found with centre and centre-right audiences, and again across the board, is the frame of waste. That no one really wants to be wasting energy. We want to make best use of the resources we have. We weren't particularly testing the frame of waste and that idea of waste in this research, but given what we know already, and this did emerge around the discussions, the cost of living crisis was uppermost for a lot of people in the focus groups. So we know, working with this audience, that the idea of net zero is a way of ensuring that we use energy properly, we use it efficiently, that we don't waste energy, is always going to be a unifying frame for discussions about building support, broadening support for net zero. We also heard in this research, and we see this time and time again, that people are taking actions already. They may not necessarily be for climate change directly. People may be using this energy to save money, but nonetheless, people have a sense of pride and want recognition for the things they're doing already to improve or reduce their impact on the environment. It's important as we go through this transition that we reinforce recognition of what people are doing already and how net zero is part and parcel of enabling people to do more, to do their bit more. The idea of a just transition has been a very popular one, a very important one in the debate. And we talk about fairness and unfairness in this research. We've been doing a lot of research, working with in 90 workshops across Europe, looking at what fairness and unfairness in the energy transition looks like in 9 different European countries. And what we see hit there, what we see in this research, is that fairness and unfairness are very quite nebulous concepts and quite difficult for people to articulate what a fair future looks like for them. But people do have very strong feelings about what is unfair to them, and we'll talk about this a bit more as we move forward. What we saw with our work sort of post-COVID and COP26, when we were looking at researching the BTC segments, there seemed to be a sense of increased sense, a stronger sense of the world, that we're interconnected. The world is interconnected. It's one world. We have a shared fate. But with that, also the narrative of energy independence is a strong one, is an appealing one, we saw in this research. And those aren't necessarily in conflict. Of course, we can increase our energy independence. We can't be entirely energy independent from the world, but we can increase our independence as part of that global effort to drive down emissions and build a clean and sustainable future. And the other thing we see, and again, this comes through the research a lot, what is the future that people want? And often it's around quite softer stuff. It's not a technical discussion so much, but it's about a world of increased respect and balance with nature, with each other, increased community, time with communities, time with families. And again, positioning net zero as a frame which helps us reach this kind of future is again going to remain powerful and a useful frame to be using as we move through the energy transition towards net zero. So I just want to put the work we're doing today in that broader context of what we know already and what this work is confirming, and where it's deepening our understanding of how to approach net zero communications. So with that in mind, I shall now pass over to Emma to talk about how we did this research.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, I'm Emma. I was a researcher on this project and at Climate Outreach, and I'll now take you through a bit of information about what we did on this research project. So to start with, we used the Britain Talks Climate segmentation model, as has already been mentioned. This was created in collaboration with the European Climate Foundation, More in Common and YouGov. So you can see the segmentation model on the slide here. But for this research project, we focused on these 4 segments. So these are established liberals, loyal nationals, disengaged traditionalists, and backbone conservatives. So Britain Talks Climate offers more depth and nuance on top of political leanings. But while these 4 segments' votes do vary, their values tend to sit somewhere around the centre-right, which has already been mentioned. And the reason why we chose these 4 segments to focus on for this research project is because previously we found high levels of reactiveness to the perceived unfairness of certain policies among these segments. So because of this, we need an effective evidence-based engagement strategy for these 4 segments. This is needed to prevent backlash and to secure backing for new decarbonisation policies. So now, just to draw on our methodology, we collaborated with ECF and YouGov to design and deliver a mixed methods research methodology. And as you can see from this figure, each stage of this methodology informed the next. So to start with, in November 2021, ECF conducted 5 stakeholder interviews. These interviews weren't with the segments, but were with leading organisations in the field. And we conducted these because the interviews helped us to understand what kind of focus we should have for this research and what kind of questions to focus on that would be of interest to the climate engagement community. Next, we went on to conduct a nationally representative survey in January 2022. This was with over 4,000 participants, and this was with all Britain Talks Climate segments. We then moved on to conduct online focus groups in February 2022. We conducted 4 two-hour online focus groups, and these were with the 4 segments of focus, and there was 8 participants in each. And finally, from February to April 2022, we synthesised and analysed our results, and all of our results are climate outreach analyses of the YouGov data. So now I will take you through a few insights from our findings from this research. So to start with, we wanted to focus on climate concern and politics and how this came up in our results. So we found that climate concern is high among these segments, but it is not seen as a political issue. So people are concerned about climate change, but they're thinking about it in terms of climate impacts. So this is mainly destruction from extreme weather, harm to nature, and negative impacts on future generations. And these impacts we found were resonating across political and demographic divides. Harm to nature does continue to be a dominant concern among these segments, but through this research we found other concerns include cost of living and suffering for the world's poorest, which I'll touch on a bit more in the next slide. So despite finding climate change as a concern in relation to these climate impacts, we actually found that the majority of segments are not engaging with climate change in terms of politics or policies. So climate change is not a priority for people's vote. We found that there were low awareness of climate policies among these segments, and we found that segments are largely not sure which party has the best climate policies. So thinking about those results, I now just want to take you to this table of results. So we asked participants what they were most worried that climate change would do. So finishing the sentence, I am worried that climate change will. This table shows the top 5 worries per segment. So we have the rank of worries along the left, so 1 to 5, and then we have the segments along the top. As I mentioned earlier, we did survey all respondents from all segments, and this was to get a picture of how perceptions and attitudes towards net zero and fairness differ across the segments. And what's interesting here is the difference that we're seeing in the most significant worries between the socially liberal segments and the segments who describe their politics somewhere around the centre right. So we can see here that Backbench Conservatives, disengaged traditionalists and loyal nationals are more worried that climate change will cause bills and costs to rise. So you can see this, I've highlighted this towards the left of the graph. Of course, this falls in with the current times, with the cost of living crisis and energy price hikes. But we also found that people were reporting widespread worry that climate change will cause additional rises in their bills in the next 10 years. And if you move towards the right of the graph, in contrast, we can see that established liberals are more concerned about suffering for the world's poorest than the other 3 segments of focus, than Backbench Conservatives, disengaged traditionalists and loyal nationals. This indicates their more socially liberal and globalist views, and this lines up with the other more socially liberal segments, so disengaged battlers, civic pragmatists and progressive activists. You can see that especially progressive activists are worried about suffering for the world's poorest at 79%. I then wanted to draw your attention to the harm, nature and wildlife worry. So as you can see, as I mentioned earlier, this is a dominant concern across the segments, and this is really unifying the segments when talking about these climate impacts and climate concerns. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of some of the climate concerns and politics results we found from this research. And I'll now pass over to my colleague Louisa, who will take you through a few more insights from each of the 4 segments that we focused on.
Great, thanks very much, Emma. Yes, and just so you know, the images you'll be seeing on these slides are not supposed to be people of those segments, but those are images we believe appeal to those segments based on their values. All right, so established liberals in many ways differ from the other segments we looked at in depth, and that's largely owing to their socially liberal and globalist views and the increased likelihood they have to be from a higher income background. Most established liberals think that richer countries should pay to help poorer countries adapt to climate change. So 59% of them support this and only 21% oppose this. In terms of fairness, they're in favor of special rules for special circumstances over a same rules for all approach. So they believe it is fairer for lower income households to receive government support and tax benefits for environmental changes they make. Among the 4 segments we looked at in depth, they're the most willing to change certain aspects of their lifestyles. So whilst they fly the most overall, they're also most willing to pay a flight tax, and 44% said they were willing to pay an extra flight tax on or after their 2nd return flight per year. 45% said they were willing to reduce meat consumption, and 3% said they were very likely, and 14% said they were likely to install a heat pump in the near future. However, we found established liberals to be less in favor of low traffic neighborhoods and also increased taxes. So from that, we gathered that the risk with established liberals lies in them feeling like they are being made to choose between the environment and the economy, and that they don't see net zero as a necessary condition for economic success. The opportunity, on the other hand, is getting established liberals to see a successful role for Britain in the world, and where those with the broadest shoulders also bear the burden of global issues like climate change, and for them to see a role for themselves also as champions of new green solutions within that. So our narrative recommendation for established liberals would be emphasizing net zero policies that address the destruction of nature and biodiversity and demonstrate its urgency, as well as policies that simultaneously protect the environment and the economy. Moving on to loyal nationals. So loyal nationals tend to and anger towards elites and them taking advantage and making their own rules. So this is also reflected in the possible impacts of net zero for them. So 21% think that net zero will have a fairly negative, and 23% think it will have a very negative impact on equality between the rich and the poor. Loyal nationals are amongst the least knowledgeable of net zero. So in our survey, 39%. Sorry, can you still hear me?
Yes, we've got you, Lisa.
Okay, right. Thanks. Okay, so 39% selected the wrong definition of net zero in our survey. And they're also the most likely segment to want to have a say in what changes and when. They have very strong fairness concerns, and their views on what is fair scales by income. So taxing the rich is seen as fair, but grants to the rich are seen as unfair. They show higher support for low traffic neighborhoods. 63% of them want streets to be less polluted and less congested, and they also support higher taxation on larger and heavier vehicles. So the risk for us with loyal nationals is that they may react badly to feeling like they don't have a say on net zero, and the perceived hypocrisy and unfair treatment might lead to further erosions of trust. The opportunity there lies with loyal nationals getting behind a fairly clear and straightforward policy that represents a fair outcome for people like them in one specific policy domain. And our narrative recommendation is for policies focusing on nature and mitigating against the effects of climate change, as those will resonate with their views that the UK needs to be better prepared for the impacts of climate change. Moving on to disengaged traditionalists. So for this segment, a very strong characteristic is feeling unrepresented by a range of societal actors. So when we ask them who they feel represents their interests in our survey, 51% selected none of the above for a whole list of actors we presented them with. They're also among the least knowledgeable about net zero, where in our survey, 40% selected the wrong answer. And they believe environmental taxes and benefits to be generally unfair, no matter whether they're for the rich or the poor. So as such, they believe it's especially unfair for high-income households to receive government grants and tax benefits for environmental changes they make. But at the same time, they also don't see these policies as fair for low-income households. Their support for environmental policies tends to be lower than that of other segments. So they're among the least likely to support low traffic neighborhoods, and they're also least likely to want to pay a flight tax. And 40% of them said they were completely unwilling to pay any kind of flight tax. So the risk lies in disengaged traditionalists' quite shallow engagement with net zero and climate action as it is. And so they're quite susceptible to being swayed in their opinions. And the fact that they think of the world as fundamentally unfair also means that fairness arguments in favor of climate action are not likely to land. Opportunities lie in selecting one or two areas in which connections with this group can be strengthened through things like cost of living or retraining workers, for example. And our narrative recommendation is linking net zero policies to a diverse range of everyday issues that concern disengaged traditionalists to bring the issue closer to them. So for instance, talking about nature and biodiversity is a way to reduce mental health issues. And then finally, to look at Backbench Conservatives. This segment is most likely to want the same rules for everyone rather than special rules for special circumstances. And for them, fairness means treating everyone the same, everyone playing by the same rules. And you can also see that reflected in the quote here. They believe that the most important aspects in the UK's effort to reach net zero are working together internationally to reduce emissions, preventing basic costs from rising, maintaining economic growth, and retraining workers. But we also found them to be somewhat open to changing parts of their lifestyle. So among Backbench Conservatives, 50% stated that they were open to eating less meat or already don't eat meat. 3% said they were very likely, and 11% said they were likely to install a heat pump. And 70% of them believe that environmental and economic outcomes are both achievable, but they want to ensure economic well-being. So finally, for their risks and opportunities, the risk here lies with Backbench Conservatives feeling like they're being made to choose between the economy and the environment. The opportunity lies in sound economic and nation-growing arguments for net zero that focus on maintaining the economy, seeking energy independence through renewables, and retraining workers. And our narrative recommendation is that policies that protect natural landscapes and biodiversity as a way of feeling proud of the British countryside. And similarly to established liberals, Backbench Conservatives may also respond well to net zero policies that simultaneously protect the environment and the economy. Thanks.
Thank you, Louisa. That was excellent, very interesting results there. And so now I'm going to pass to Susie, Dr. Susie Wang, who's going to talk about, really sort of synthesize this down and build on those insights around recommendations, around risks and opportunities, to reflect on some do's and don'ts for climate communicators, communicating climate change at these very difficult times with rising house prices and a very, rising cost of living and very uncertain future. So over to you, Susie. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone for your attention so far. Yeah, as Chris mentioned, I'm going to be finishing this up with some key suggestions and takeaway messages. If we could move on to the next slide, please, Emma. Thank you. All right, so starting from the top on the first point there, as ever, we find the term doing your bit to have resonance across the segments that we spoke to. As Louisa mentioned, the 4 segments that we focused on in this research to some extent all have some level of openness to changing their personal behaviors, some more than others, and that is a reflection of sort of the differences in means and motivations between these 4 segments as well. So in terms of motivations, certain segments who may not sort of choose to change their lifestyles for climate change reasons may instead want to live low carbon lives for other reasons, such as reducing waste or increasing efficiency, or for instance, eating more healthily. For the former, so about means and capacity, a couple of the segments that we spoke to, for instance, loyal nationals and disengaged traditionalists, talked about a lack of accessibility and affordability of many of the environmental changes that we spoke about, so electric cars and heat pumps, for instance, and named especially affordability as a significant barrier to changing their actions. And so remembering also that households that tend to come from, on average, lower income segments also tend to have relatively low carbon footprints as well. So perhaps related to that, the second point about fairness. Fairness was obviously a big part of this project, but it was a difficult topic for segments to talk about. There are some general similarities across the board. So for instance, segments mostly agreed that it's fairer for low-income households to receive government grants and tax benefits than it would be for high-income households to receive those same measures. And similarly, there's sort of broad agreement that it's fairer for higher-income households to pay more taxes, whether that's vehicle taxes or other taxes, than low-income households for net zero. So there's this general sense of agreement around not being asked to do more than what you can or your fair share. But as I mentioned, it's a difficult topic. Responses tended to be instinctive, and some people struggled to describe what they felt fairness meant to them. And as Louisa alluded to, the 4 segments that we spoke to had different views of fairness between them and understand the term differently. So we also need to be careful when talking about fairness to assume that fairness is understood in the same way in all contexts. And it's worth mentioning here that Climate Outreach is releasing a fairness report that will be launched soon. So yeah, keep an eye out for that if you're signed up to our newsletter. We'll be sort of integrating some of these results, but more. And on the third point, so when we talked about fairness, people actually seem to find it easier to talk about unfairness. And many of the people in the focus groups, for instance, had the feeling that they're starting from an uneven playing field. And so being treated unfairly is what they must expect and look out for. So as a consequence, there's a sensitivity around policies and potential costs that certain segments fear won't be executed fairly. So for instance, significant minorities of the segments that we looked at, so the nationals, disengaged traditionalists, Backbench Conservatives in particular, wouldn't support a flight tax at any stage, no matter how many flights you've taken, even though quite a significant portion of these segments generally don't fly enough to be affected by these policies. So it's important to be careful and to not underestimate the level of concern about unfairness, and to sort of acknowledge these feelings and channel them towards areas of common ground. So I glanced at the Q&A, for instance, and there's a question about, for instance, enforcement of strong rules. And in this case, we did find some consensus around making sure that big businesses are held accountable for their emissions. So that's an area of unfairness that people seem to agree on. And finally, for this last point, on this slide, at an international level, the segments of Britain largely seem to agree that tackling climate change requires a global effort. So it's important, while it's important to talk about the UK's efforts, we also need to talk about them alongside those of other countries. The segments that we spoke to thought it was a good thing for the country to set a positive example for the world, but worry about other countries not pulling their weight. And there was sort of not a lot of knowledge of what other countries have done, for instance, whether other countries have also set net zero targets. So talking about the significant steps that other countries have made can help to convince these segments that the UK is not acting alone. Next slide, please. Thank you. And as Louisa mentioned, there are a couple of segments, Backbench Conservatives and Established Liberals, that for instance, where we talk about economic growth and environmental protection as two things that the majority see as relatively compatible, but if they feel like they have to choose between the two, it could be that many among these segments may choose the economy over the environment. In terms of our recommendations, we would suggest that communicators can avoid this by talking about how net zero is a way to improve financial well-being as well as environmental outcomes, for instance, by reducing cost of living pressures and cutting energy bills, but also by actively avoiding framing environment and the economy in competition or in opposition to each other. And when talking about net zero, there's the opportunity to broaden out what we talk about. So bringing in ideas of co-benefits and linking net zero to things like improving our health and well-being, which was something that segments are already pretty positive about and see positive impacts of net zero on our health and well-being, as well as linking to sort of wider concerns about nature and wildlife that Emma spoke to earlier. And the reason we have this point is because the segments that we spoke to aren't really deeply engaging with the details of net zero policies, and don't necessarily see the relevance to their daily lives as yet. So an approach that focuses on values, on the elements of a good life, so being part of a community, of being healthy and your family, having your family around you, all of these things may be a valuable way of forming these connections to the idea of net zero, which can be quite abstract. As Chris and Amira alluded to, this piece of research was done sort of off the back of several months of rising gas and fuel prices and during the start of the Russia-Ukraine war. So understandably, segments were concerned about all of these things. And here, there's an opportunity to talk about making Britain more self-reliant, and this could be, for instance, talking about renewable energy in the UK as a way to make sure that we're more energy independent. But on this point, it's important to be careful about the connections between these issues. So our research suggests that people aren't really making these clear connections between climate change and net zero and energy prices, and these connections are still tenuous. And finally, as a last point, as always, the issue of trust is crucial. We've tried over the last 2 years to identify trusted messengers in various different ways, and we consistently find quite low trust across the segments. In this particular project, we asked about representation, and in this case, segments, particularly disengaged traditionalists and disengaged battlers, had didn't feel that any person or group that we suggested to them truly represented their interests and their values. And this sort of pervasive combination of low trust and low awareness and engagement with net zero policies may pose a significant risk, a significant barrier. So for instance, people may not trust the message that net zero will deliver jobs or other positive outcomes, and an overly positive account of net zero coming in and sort of solving many societal problems is likely to be rejected by many of these segments, particularly those who've been marginalized and whose trust have been eroded over time. And on this point, restoring trust does take time, but it seems like it's more necessary than ever to work with groups that we can identify as more trusted than others. So this could be local community groups, it could be charities that work with protecting animals or the environment or working with vulnerable groups. And we have an opportunity here to work together to make sure that these segments do feel represented and do feel like there are people that they can go to and trust in society. Thank you. I think I will leave it there. As Chris mentioned earlier, this is just a small part of all of the work that we are putting up. So please take some time to explore the full findings on the website. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susie, Emma and Louisa. Fantastic presentation. As I say, that's just a skim across the top of some of the findings we found. A great set of questions in the Q&A, which we're going to move to in just a moment. Can you just go to the next slide, please, Emma? Thank you. So while we think about start moving into the Q&A, if you have any thoughts about what was useful about the content of this presentation, would really help us to improve what we're doing and making sure that the analysis and the communication of the research that we're doing is meeting your needs as communicators and in the wider sector. So as we're talking, if you have any thoughts about any changes we could make to the presentation or what was good about the presentation, what you liked, then that would be really helpful for us. So thanks very much. So I will kick off with the Q&A. And I think actually while I'm just collating my thoughts, Susie, could you just quickly, I think you've got a slide which just shows where the toolkit that gives access to this broader, deeper range of work, where it sits and how people can use that. Is that possible to share that just while I just go through Q&As and pull those into some kind of structured sets of questions? Thanks so much.
Yeah, no problem. I will just quickly share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see this. Okay, so what you're looking at now is the Britain Talks Climate Web Toolkit. And you can see the URL up here. This is where we've put all of the latest findings. So scrolling through the landing page, you can access the latest updates by clicking this link and go straight to where we've added new information. Or you can scroll down to the big picture and see this new link here, which talks about net zero, fairness, and climate politics. There are also some other new pages that will be that are flagged with this new symbol, such as trust, for instance. But for now, I'll click through to net zero, and you can see there are these headers, and these will take you to shortcuts. So for instance, if you're interested particularly in net zero, you can click here, and it will take you directly to the net zero content. We've also made some changes to the segment pages, that the 4 segments that we focused on in this research. So you can click through to them this way, but also through the main main toolkit. And as an example, here's the Backbench Conservatives. You'll see these are the original placards that we had for the information on Backbench Conservatives before. And now you can click through to the new net zero findings by using that shortcut. So that was a really quick overview, but hopefully that was enough of a tour to get you started. And yeah, enjoy. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Susie. Yeah, please do go there. All the detail, all the numbers, all the percentages, the stats, everything's there. Also with some more detailed breakdown from the research focus groups recommendations. Okay, so now it falls to me to make some sense of what a really great set of questions. I could spend hours talking about these. We haven't got hours, we've got 15 minutes or so. So I'm going to try and collate these and push them back to the researchers. The first one, which is a number of questions around speed of change, around, what kind of speed of change did we think the people we spoke to and surveyed would be up for, talking about this idea of system change, to what extent there's an appetite for this broader, perhaps more radical change to what we're doing and how we get to net zero. And kind of related to that, do we feel that the language of net zero, etc., is changing how people approach this from beyond emission reductions to a broader vision of what a good and desirable tomorrow looks like? So I'm going to put that back to anyone who feels able to answer that question. Are we moving away from just a discussion of specific emissions reductions here and there to a broader discussion of what that desirable future looks like and how quickly we're going to get there? Does anyone fancy having a go at that very interesting but perhaps challenging question?
I can make a start, but anyone else feel free to jump in. Yeah, I think that from the work that we've done with the segments, it's clear that where they are is not the point of emissions reduction, but the point of sort of they're much more likely to engage with these value-based ideas about living a good life and contributing to a cause like climate change action or protecting the environment that's greater than sort of just their own lives. I think to the point about the speed of change, I think that's a really interesting one. It is something that we briefly touched on in this piece of work, and I think a number of the segments really do want to see change quickly. And for instance, Loyal Nationals, I think in focus groups are talking about how they wish that change had happened earlier because now it seems there are worries that it's too late. For other segments, it might be more distant. So for disengaged traditionalists, for instance, their engagement with the topic of climate action and net zero is much more distant and abstract. So I think that answer differs depending on which segment you're speaking to and at what moment in time as well.
Thank you, Susie. That's a great answer. And I think also I would add to that, there's some other questions there about talking about economic growth and does that kind of constrain what kind of debate emerges, etc. And of course, with research, respondents will answer the questions put to them. But within that, we see time and time again, this issue of concern for nature and the natural environment is a key, consistently strong motivator or area of concern for people and their worries about climate change. And I think that there is more work to be done in exploring that frame and how that can help us. I do feel that it is difficult for people to respond to these issues like net zero on a policy by policy or technical basis. Some people have some interest in that, but broadly people are responding emotionally. And it's not just us, other research people using these segments, but people, what do they want? Ultimately, it seems to come through again and again. The good life is one of closer connections to nature, respect for nature, a healthier environment, healthy relationships with each other, time to have those relationships with each other, with family, etc. So I think there is something to explore there, that if net zero is a route to reduce emissions from the status quo, is that going to engage people enough? But then also some of the other questions here, I think there's an issue about trust. Whatever we say, or whatever the vision is, to believe in the speed of the change, the ability for those changes to be delivered is dependent on trust in the messenger. This is like a shortcut. If I trust the messenger, I'll take on board what I'm hearing. And at the moment, what the research is showing, not just us, but elsewhere, is this precipitous decline in trust in politicians and other kind of anonymous or distant voices. So that is one of the questions that came up is like, well, what's the priority here within these segments? There's lots of, we've got all these different policies, all these different segments, different life circumstances. How do we make sense of that? What is the priority? I want to suggest the priority is identifying trusted messengers and trusted channels of communication is going to be a key part of delivering net zero and broadening, maintaining and deepening the social mandate for that. And building on that, there's any thoughts, any reflections and other questions come up is around the role of, speaking to this fairness issue again, and the different ways people think about fairness, and the question around rules and regulations. What did we hear in the research about people's desire for strong rules and regulations? How much was that an important element of building support for these policies, knowing that they're going to be dealt with fairly and implemented fairly? Any insights on that area, please?
I can start off if that's helpful. Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and it was definitely a big part of this research with rules and regulations. I think it differed across the segments we focused on. For example, with loyal nationals, it was quite clear that they wanted fairness, and they didn't want some people getting more from society than others. They wanted everyone to have fair opportunities, especially with thinking about elites, making sure that everyone gets the same opportunities in life. And I think, yeah, it really kind of differed across segments, but there was general consensus for different rules for different people. So yeah, just thought I would start off there.
Thanks, Emma. And just to add on that, we asked this question about rules for businesses and for individuals. And what we found is that people were much more likely to support strong enforcing rules for businesses than they were for individuals, likely due to some of the themes that we were discussing earlier, fears of sort of unfair distribution of policies and things like that. So this enforcement of the rules depends on the recipient of those rules as well.
Thanks so much. There's so many interesting questions here. We've got 5 minutes, so I'm going to kind of return to the questions, and I'm going to go by those which have had the most kind of upvotes, as it were. And I'll probably take this first one because I mentioned at the beginning, but the question was raised about this idea of reinforcing people's sense of pride in the actions that they're taking. And if those actions are piecemeal, are something of a dead end, are a substitute for the real change that needs to be made, then are we right to reinforce the validity of those actions or congratulate people for those actions? And what I was trying to say at the beginning, and I think this is still true, so we always say, and it's right, we've got to start from where people are. And if we dismiss what the actions people feel that they're taking and that have an impact on their impact on environment, and they want recognition for that, I do feel that is the right place to start. But what then that is simply the starting point. There's so much more to be done. And I think there is broad recognition of just emerging of the scale of the changes needed. And that net zero, in a way, or those related policies, frameworks, should be thought of as a way of supporting people in doing more and helping them do more as part of this broader social change. So it shouldn't be that, yeah, well done, well, you're doing a bit of recycling and you're eating meat one less day a week, so you're okay, you're off the hook, you're doing your bit. Not at all. But we've got to find the positive paths to build on where people are. And I think it's you know, if we think we're going to re-engineer human consciousness or what it is people want or their political orientation, I don't think we're going to get very far. We do have to build from where we are and in a positive and productive and collective way to achieve these changes. So that's my response. It's a great question. It's something that's gone round, you know, round in my mind, but I think that is an important point. So one back to the team. Again, this has had a lot of votes support for it. This idea of backbone conservatives having high level of support for reducing meat eating, when normally we would associate backbone conservatives with being resistant to this and associate them with the farming community, rural communities, etc. It would seem to be in conflict with what we might suppose would be the attitude of backbone conservatives to changing their diets and generally the nation eating less meat. Is any reflections from the team on that question?
This was a really sorry. Go on, Louisa.
Go for it, Emma.
This was a really interesting finding that we found, and a lot of it with backbone conservatives we found was yes to do with the environment, but also to do with health. And we did still find concern for farmers and farming communities, but overall they were willing to change their diet in some way, and yes, a lot of it was to do with health.
Yeah, and maybe to clarify that, in the survey we asked the question, in principle, to reduce carbon emissions, how much would you be willing to limit your meat consumption? So we could have asked, you know, thinking about all the effects this might have on farmers, how much would you be willing to limit your meat consumption? That would have given us a very different answer probably, but just focus on the individual and what Emma said. And on that level, it's often about health and less about the cultural impacts and sort of the cultural meaning of meat eating. There, people were quite open to it, yeah.
And just to add before we move on, I was personally surprised by this result as well. But in addition to what Louisa and Emma have already said, I think what came out clearly in focus groups is that people were open to it in their daily lives, but it needed to be an individual choice. And they were opposed to, for instance, the idea of public canteens only serving vegetarian or vegan meals, for instance, because then that removes that element of individual freedom.
Great, thank you. And I wonder, you know, as I say, whether we would get a different answer if it was just rural backbone conservatives we were speaking to from a mix, but that's is something to explore further. What's the best way to talk about just transition and climate justice to conservative-leaning audiences? And because we're running short of time, I'll quickly say one of the things that we found previously in research is we talk about a fair world. Then at a broad level, that frame is less politically loaded than discussions of climate justice, which are often associated with the left-wing discourse, which some conservative audiences may find off-putting. But over and above that, come back to the point that fairness and unfairness are often very, rather than being, I have a strong vision of what a fair future looks like, and I believe it can be achieved. It's often about what feels unfair to me, what feels like a threat to me, and what I'm trying to do in my identity. And it actually is, I would say, you just have to sit down and listen and talk with people and understand what it is that feels like a threat, feels unfair to them, and that will vary. But beyond this kind of using the frame fairness as opposed to justice, I would it's difficult to make very broad sweeping generalizations about that. It is a difficult subject. Well, we think in the sector often we have an idea of the importance of fairness. It's not as clear always for people. One last question, which is been highlighted here as well, is about, is it advisable to use the term net zero? This is the last question. Using the term net zero at all in local communications, so it's better to aim at getting people more comfortable with it. You know, what do we think about this phrase net zero? Is it a useful and helpful one in the energy transition and trying to build a fair energy transition?
Yeah, I can have a go. I have to say I don't have the definitive answer to this, but based on this research, it seems like net zero is not quite a term that a lot of people are familiar with, but we also ask a similar question. I think, what was it? a couple of months ago, and it seems like awareness has increased, and the advantage, I mean, net zero is something that the UK government has pledged to do, and it's something that a lot of countries around the world have pledged to do. And maybe the next step is to connect net zero to people's lives in a way that's more meaningful to them than emissions reduction and balancing sort of country level emissions.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you for those very challenging questions, but that shows that people are really engaging with this and engaged with the webinar, and I'm very grateful for that. That's reassuring to know and good to know. Sorry for those questions we've not been able to get to in the time that we've had today. As I say, the toolkit has much more detail about the research there. This is a conversation that's ongoing, obviously, but I feel that from this research, we've identified some key structures, frameworks, and recommendations for helping us to build and sustain broad social engagement with net zero at a difficult time. And at the moment, concern for climate change, desire for change remains high. And so there's a very strong foundation from which we can continue to build with our work. So that is reassuring and good to know, and we just need to make sure we continue our work with the best evidence in place. And thanks once again for your time and attention today. And as we leave this now, you'll see there'll be a link to a survey. If you have time to fill that out, that'd be great. And thanks also for your feedback on the presentation today. This is all really helpful for us, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon. Thanks very much, everyone.